In the grand tapestry of history, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is often cited as the final act of the Byzantine Empire, a cataclysm that unleashed ripples of consequence across Europe and beyond. Yet this perspective belies a more intricate reality, one steeped in centuries of decline, internal discord, and relentless external pressures. By the time the Ottomans breached the city's walls, Constantinople had become a shadow of its former self, a city grappling with the weight of history, even as it teetered on the precipice of oblivion. Driven by a sequence of events that spanned generations, the end of Byzantium was not merely a single event, it was the culmination of 1,000 years of triumphs and tribulations, a poignant reminder that the tapestry of civilization is woven from both splendor and decay. In the centuries leading up to the fall of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire experienced a slow and painful fragmentation. Once a dominant force in the Mediterranean, the empire had begun to lose its grip on territories that were not only geographically vital, but also symbolically significant. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 marked a critical turning point. The defeat of the Byzantine army against the Seljuk Turks initiated a downward spiral that would see the empire gradually cede vast swaths of land. This territorial loss was not merely a military setback. It resulted in a profound psychological shift among the Byzantine populace, who began to view their state not as a beacon of Christian orthodoxy, but as a dwindling power beset by foes. Consequently, a collective sense of despair emerged, one that would haunt the empire's leaders and citizens alike. As the Ottoman Empire rose, it exploited the fractures within Byzantine society. The Ottomans, led by Sultan Mehmed II, viewed Constantinople not just as a strategic prize, but as a symbol of their ascendancy, the apex of their imperial aspirations. The siege of 1453 was not merely a military campaign, it was a statement of intent, an assertion that the era of Christian Byzantine hegemony was finished. The Ottomans were methodical in their approach, employing advanced artillery, including the massive cannon designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, which could breach the ancient walls of the city. This formidable weapon, capable of launching stones weighing several hundred pounds, would resonate in the minds of the defenders, instilling a profound sense of dread. Inevitably, the psychological impact of such innovations rendered the walls, long viewed as impregnable, vulnerable. Internal strife further complicated the Byzantine response to the Ottoman threat. The empire was rife with political instability, characterized by power struggles among nobility and the rising influence of the Orthodox Church at the expense of the imperial authority. The civil wars of the late 14th and early 15th centuries exacerbated the situation, leaving the empire divided. A letter penned by the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos in the spring of 1449 revealed the depths of despair as he appealed for assistance from the West, articulating the empire's dire need for unity against the encroaching Ottomans. However, his pleas fell largely on deaf ears as the Western powers were embroiled in their own conflicts, including the 100 Years' War. Consequently, the Byzantine leadership, struggling to maintain cohesion, found itself increasingly isolated. The cultural and religious tensions within the city further clouded the Byzantine response to the Ottoman threat. The schism between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church had deepened over the centuries, leading to mutual suspicion and animosity. Efforts to reconcile these differences were often stymied by historical grievances and doctrinal disputes, sapping the empire's strength at a critical juncture. This internal discord was not merely a theological debate, it was a conflict that shaped the very identity of the empire. It was against this backdrop that the city's defenders, a motley collection of soldiers, citizens, and foreign mercenaries, prepared for the siege. A young archer, barely 20 years of age, stood atop the walls, heart pounding as the Ottoman banners unfurled in the distance, unaware that he would become a footnote in this tragic saga. His dreams of glory would be extinguished in the chaos, lost to history as the city he sought to protect fell into the hands of an advancing tide. The actual siege lasted for 53 days, a grueling test of endurance for both the besiegers and the besieged. The atmosphere was thick with desperation, a palpable tension that enveloped the city. As the Ottoman forces mounted their final assault on May 29, the defenders, despite their bravery, found themselves outmatched and outnumbered. A breach was finally made, and chaos ensued within the city streets, a cacophony of clashing swords, desperate cries, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Driven by desperation and the understanding that the fall of the city would signal the end of their way of life, the defenders fought valiantly, yet the momentum was inexorably shifting. The walls, once symbols of Byzantine resilience, crumbled before the might of the Ottoman artillery, and with each falling stone, the fate of an era was sealed. As the sun set on that fateful day, the once proud city of Constantinople was irrevocably transformed. What had been a bastion of Christendom, where the echoes of the past mingled with the hopes of a future, was now a conquered territory, its inhabitants facing an uncertain fate under Ottoman rule. Yet the legacy of this moment extends beyond the immediate aftermath. It reshaped not only the geopolitical landscape of the region, but also the spiritual and cultural fabric of Europe. Had the defenders received timely reinforcements, or had the Ottomans faced a sudden delay, the outcome might have shifted, perhaps allowing for a renaissance of Byzantine resilience. Instead, the fall of Constantinople marked the closing of one chapter and the uncertain opening of another, one that would reverberate through the ages, influencing the development of nations and faiths. In the years that followed, the echoes of the city's fall would be felt far and wide, stirring both fear and fascination. It served as a stark reminder of the ephemeral nature of power and the fragility of human endeavor. The legacy of this event, woven into the fabric of modernity, still resonates today, as the borders drawn and the ideologies forged in the wake of that siege continue to shape our world, underscoring the unbreakable chain of history that binds us to the past. As the winds of change swept through the eastern Mediterranean in the spring of 1453, the ancient walls of Constantinople stood defiant against the encroaching might of the Ottoman Empire. For nearly a millennium, this city had been the seat of empires, a bastion of Christendom, and a crossroads of cultures. Yet a grim shadow loomed on the horizon, heralded by the determined march of Sultan Mehmed II, who sought not merely to conquer, but to transform the very fabric of this storied city. Driven by a vision that extended far beyond the mere capture of a territory, Mehmed was fueled by an ambition to establish a new capital for a burgeoning empire, hoping to herald the rise of Islam's dominance in the region. Consequently, the siege of Constantinople would not be just a military campaign, it would become a monumental clash between two worlds, a cataclysmic confrontation between Islam and Christianity that would reverberate through history. Within the besieged city, Emperor Constantine XI became the embodiment of resilience amidst despair. As the cannons of the Ottomans roared and the ground trembled under the weight of their assault, Constantine found himself a leader besieged not only by the enemy without, but also by the growing trepidation that gnawed at his people within. Letters from the front lines painted a dire picture. Supplies were dwindling, morale was faltering, and the weary defenders were running low on hope, even as they held fast to their faith. Consequently, Constantine mobilized his forces, calling upon every able-bodied man to defend the city's formidable walls, the very barriers that had withstood countless sieges over the centuries. He understood that the fate of Constantinople was entwined with the legacy of Christianity, and with every passing day that legacy seemed more tenuous. As the siege commenced, the Ottomans employed strategies that would become hallmarks of warfare in the age of gunpowder. The deployment of massive cannons, such as the Great Bombard, symbolized a terrifying leap forward in military technology. These colossal weapons, capable of hurling stone projectiles weighing several tons, could shatter the thick Byzantine walls that had stood for generations. A weather report from the week of the siege indicates a pall of smoke and dust hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder, a sensory assault that must have profoundly affected the morale of both attackers and defenders. In direct response, the defenders of Constantinople, aware of their technological disadvantage, focused on their defensive strategies with meticulous care, reinforcing the walls with sandbags and stone, creating makeshift barriers in a desperate attempt to deter the advancing enemy. The psychological state of both the besieged and the besiegers was steeped in the zeitgeist of their times, a heady mix of fervent nationalism and religious zeal. For Mehmed, the siege represented an existential moment, a chance to assert Islamic supremacy over a Christian stronghold. He envisioned a triumph that would echo through the ages, one that would legitimize his reign and solidify his dynasty's power. Conversely, for Constantine and his people, the siege was a matter of survival, one that wrapped itself in layers of theological significance. The stakes were not merely territorial, they were existential, rooted in a fear of cultural obliteration. The words of a soldier, scribbled in the margins of a hastily written letter, resonate. We are not just fighting for walls, but for our very souls. Thus, the siege became a crucible, forging an identity that would haunt the collective memory of Europe for centuries to come. As the days dragged into weeks, the toll of the siege weighed heavily upon both sides. The Ottomans, with their disciplined ranks and relentless pursuit of victory, began to exploit the weaknesses of the defenders. Their tactics included psychological warfare, using loud war drums and the cries of their soldiers to dishearten the besieged. In sharp contrast, the defenders of Constantinople, bolstered by their faith and desperation, employed every means at their disposal, from archery to boiling oil, to repel the invaders. Additionally, the walls of Constantinople became a canvas for stories of heroism, tales of individual sacrifice woven into the larger narrative of the siege. One such tale is that of a young woman, a nurse within the city, who, despite the chaos, tended to the wounded, her hands stained with blood, yet unwavering in her resolve to save lives amidst despair. Inevitably, the relentless bombardment took its toll. Each breach in the walls was a crack not merely in stone, but in hope itself, a tangible manifestation of the despair that began to suffuse the hearts of the defenders. The walls crumbled under the sheer force of the Ottoman artillery, each echo of cannon fire reverberating like a death knell for the city. Had the defenders managed to implement a last-minute plan to flood the moat, perhaps the outcome could have shifted, buying precious time for the arrival of reinforcements. Yet, as the sun rose on May 29th,
1453, the hour of reckoning had come. With a final thunderous assault, Mehmed's forces surged through the shattered defenses, marking the end of an era. As the dust of battle settled and the blood-soaked streets lay testament to the ferocity of the clash, the implications of this new order began to unfold. Mehmed, having taken the city, did not erase its past. He absorbed it, transforming Constantinople into Istanbul, a city that would serve as a bridge between two worlds. The cultural implications were profound, as the conquest catalyzed a transformation in the very identity of the region. Churches were repurposed as mosques, and the city that had once served as a shining beacon of Christian faith would become a cornerstone of Islamic civilization. Thus, the siege of Constantinople was not merely a military engagement, it was an indelible moment in history, a battle that reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe and the Middle East. The consequences of that conflict resonate into modernity, as the religious and cultural divisions established during that cataclysmic struggle continue to influence global relations today. Each street in Istanbul still bears the weight of history, a reminder that the clashing tides of faith and ambition do not easily recede, but rather linger, haunting the present as they echo through the annals of time.
The air in Constantinople, thick with the stench of smoke and desperation, hung heavy as the dawn approached on May 29, 1453. After weeks of relentless bombardment, the city's formidable walls, built to withstand centuries of sieges, began to show signs of vulnerability. The Ottomans, under the determined command of Sultan Mehmed II, had methodically dismantled the pride of Byzantine engineering, their cannon fire echoing like the tolling of a funeral bell across the battered landscape. Driven by a profound sense of inevitability, Mehmed had deployed the enormous bombard known as the basilisk, its massive iron mouth belching forth destruction, reducing stone to rubble. The psychological toll of the siege had already begun to erode the spirits of defenders and civilians alike, yet the final assault would shatter whatever remained of their resolve. As the sun crested the horizon, illuminating the shattered battlements with a ghostly light, the defenders found themselves caught in a cauldron of chaos. Inevitably, the walls succumbed on that fateful Tuesday, crumbling under the weight of Ottoman artillery. It was here, in that moment of historical reckoning, that the nuances of fear and courage collided. A young Byzantine soldier named Alexios, only 18, clung to his post. The tremors beneath his feet were not merely the result of the earth-shaking cannon fire, but echoes of his own internal dread. The adrenaline coursing through him was as intoxicating as it was terrifying, urging him to fight, even as he sensed the tide turning against them. A letter, hastily penned by his hand amidst the chaos, would later reveal the raw emotions of a man faced with the end of his world. We hold the wall, yet behind it, despair gnaws at our hearts. Consequently, as the final assault commenced, the cacophony of battle enveloped the city. The Ottoman infantry surged forward, an indomitable tide of purpose and conviction, their battle cries resounding like a war hymn. The defenders, once unified by a common cause, now found themselves fragmented, their resolve faltering in the face of overwhelming numbers. The sense of impending doom spread like wildfire through the narrow streets, where civilian lives intertwined with the fate of the city. Driven by a desperate need for survival, families scrambled to escape, trenches filled with the injured and the dying, while the echoes of despair filled the air. It was a scene that would be etched into the memory of history, a vivid tableau of chaos marked by the fragility of human life. Amidst this turmoil, the experiences of civilians painted a harrowing picture.
Mothers desperately clutched their children, shielding them from the encroaching terror, while merchants abandoned their stalls, leaving behind goods and livelihoods as the city's heartbeat quickened. A woman named Eleni, her face smeared with soot and streaked with tears, fled through the streets, the sound of her husband's voice urging her to flee still ringing in her ears. She stumbled across the threshold of a small church where the sacred space had transformed into a refuge for those who could no longer bear the weight of despair. It was there, amidst flickering candles and whispered prayers, that she witnessed the resilience of humanity, even as the world around them crumbled. The collective spirit of the people was palpable, a shared acknowledgement of their impending fate, merging with the urgency of their flight. Yet within this chaos, the defenders remained, their spirits flickering like the candles that cast shadows on the walls around them. The last line of defense, a determined group of soldiers led by General Giovanni Giustiniani, fought with a tenacity born of desperation. It was a battle not just for survival, but for the very soul of Constantinople. As the Ottoman forces breached the walls, waves of fear washed over the defenders. The reality of conquest loomed large. Inevitably, Giustiniani was wounded, forcing him to withdraw, leaving the remaining forces to grapple with the overwhelming tide of their adversaries. The shift in momentum was palpable, another critical moment where chance dictated that the fabric of history would unravel. Had Giustiniani remained in command a moment longer, perhaps the defenders could have regrouped or even launched a counteroffensive. As the breach widened, the floodgates of despair opened, and it became increasingly clear that the city was slipping from their grasp. The cries of the wounded mingled with the triumphant shouts of the Ottoman soldiers who poured into the city, marking the dawn of a new era. The streets, once vibrant with life, turned into a tapestry of devastation, homes reduced to rubble, lives shattered in an instant. The emotional impact on both defenders and civilians was a harrowing testament to the costs of war. A child, no older than 10, stood frozen in the street, eyes wide with fear, as he watched the world he knew disintegrate around him. His name was Theodorus, and in that moment he grasped not the politics of conquest or loss, but the profound sadness of a childhood stolen away. In the heart of the city, a sense of finality settled in, the dreams of a people extinguished under the weight of history. As the last vestiges of resistance crumbled, the reality of Ottoman rule took form, shaping the very future of the region. The walls, once a symbol of strength and resolve, now lay in ruins, echoing the collective sigh of a city that had endured for millennia. The emotional weight of this moment would resonate through the generations, planting the seeds of conflict and cultural shifts that would redefine the landscape of Europe and Asia alike. The breach was not merely a collapse of stone and mortar. It was the turning of a page in history, fraught with consequence, a poignant reminder of the delicate threads that weave together the tapestry of human existence.
The fall of Constantinople in May 1453 marked not merely the end of an era, but the beginning of an intricate tapestry of transformation that would envelop both the city itself and the broader geopolitical landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean. Driven by the relentless ambition of Sultan Mehmed II, the siege culminated in a dramatic confrontation where the Ottoman forces, equipped with artillery that had never before been wielded on such a scale, breached the ancient walls that had withstood numerous assaults over the centuries. Consequently, the city was not just conquered, it was reborn, emerging as Istanbul, a symbol of Ottoman power and a new center of Islamic culture. This metamorphosis was emblematic of a shift in the balance of power that would resonate through the ages, reshaping the contours of Eastern Europe and reverberating across the continent. As the sun set on the day of conquest, the streets of Istanbul, once bustling with the diverse sounds of Greek, Armenian, and Latin tongues, became infused with the call to prayer echoing from the minarets that replaced the iconic Byzantine churches. The most notable of these transformations was the Hagia Sophia, whose majestic dome would serve as a testament to the architectural prowess of both empires. Transformed from a Christian basilica into a mosque, the Hagia Sophia stood as a physical representation of the new order, embodying the complexities of cultural synthesis and conflict. The Ottoman Empire, now firmly rooted in this cradle of civilization, began to extend its influence into Europe, leading to a recalibration of power dynamics among the Christian states. Driven by this shift, neighboring kingdoms found themselves in a precarious position. Once dismissing the Ottomans as a mere threat, they now faced a formidable empire that sought territorial expansion and domination. In the aftermath of the conquest, the psychological atmosphere in Europe was one of bewilderment, fear, and in some quarters, a grudging admiration for the Ottomans' military ingenuity. Letters from Venetian merchants and diplomats conveyed a sense of urgency, as trade routes previously defined by the Constantinople nexus were now perilously at risk, forcing European powers to reassess their strategies. Consequently, the response from the Christian world was multifaceted. It ranged from despair to a call for a united front against the encroaching Ottoman advance. The papacy, alarmed by the implications of a powerful Islamic state at the gates of Europe, sought to galvanize support among Christian nations, advocating for a crusade that aimed to reclaim lost territories. This response was not merely a reaction to territorial loss, but was steeped in a deeper existential dread, one that saw the very essence of Christendom under siege. As the Ottomans expanded their reach, tensions intensified, particularly in the Balkans, where the shadows of Ottoman rule loomed large over the Christian populations. The arrival of Ottoman administrators brought significant alterations to local governance, but it also sparked resistance movements among the Slavic nations, giving rise to a complicated relationship between the empire and its subjects. Inevitably, these tensions would birth uprisings that sought to reclaim autonomy, leading to a cycle of conflict that would persist for centuries. Yet within this turmoil emerged a complex cultural exchange. The Ottomans, while authoritarian, were also patrons of the arts, fostering an environment where diverse cultural practices could flourish. This duality, oppression intertwined with cultural patronage, created a unique socio-political fabric that would define the region for generations. Amid this backdrop of transformation, the plight of individuals bore witness to the sweeping changes that swept through Istanbul and beyond. One such figure was a young Greek merchant named Alexios, navigating the newly formed streets of Istanbul in search of opportunities amidst chaos. Forced to adapt his wares and trade practices, Alexios grappled with his identity in this transformed city, trying to preserve his heritage while also embracing the new possibilities that the Ottoman rule afforded. His story was but one of countless narratives that illustrated the human dimension of this historical upheaval, each life interwoven with the larger tapestry of ambition, conquest, and cultural exchange. In this era of burgeoning empires, the notion of a new world order was not merely a geopolitical reality, it was a psychological shift that redefined how nations perceived each other. The aggressive Ottoman expansion forced European states to view Islam not solely as a religious adversary, but also as a political entity with which they had to reckon.
The long-lasting implications of this paradigm shift were profound, culminating in a complex legacy of conflict and cooperation. Trade continued to flourish in this intricate dance of diplomacy and warfare, and while animosities simmered, cultural exchanges thrived, leading to a unique synthesis of the arts, sciences, and philosophies across borders. In the years following the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire would continue to expand, reaching its zenith in the 16th century under Suleiman the Magnificent. Yet the reactions and adaptations of European powers were significant, giving rise to alliances and conflicts that would shape the modern political landscape. The very boundaries of nations were influenced by decisions made in the aftermath of that fateful siege, where a pact signed in the dim light of a tent might still bear relevance to contemporary international relations. Thus, the fall of Constantinople acted as both a catalyst and a crucible, forging new identities, alliances, and conflicts that would echo through the corridors of history. The legacy of 1453 remains a poignant reminder of how the fortunes of cities, empires, and individuals are endlessly intertwined, shaping the invisible threads that bind us to our past and illuminate the pathways of our present. As the streets of Istanbul continue to pulse with the life of its diverse inhabitants, the echoes of that historic moment linger, a testament to the enduring complexity of human civilization.
The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked not only the end of a millennium-old Christian stronghold, but also ignited a transformative series of events that would reverberate through the annals of history, shaping the contours of art, culture, and geopolitics in the centuries that followed. Driven by the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire, the city's capitulation signaled the rise of a new era, one in which the interplay between Eastern and Western civilizations would yield profound changes on both sides of the divide. The psychological state of Europe at this juncture was steeped in existential dread and fervent anticipation, as the specter of Ottoman expansion loomed large, challenging the very fabric of Christendom. This atmosphere of uncertainty and urgency became the crucible within which the Renaissance would emerge, a cultural revival that sought not only to reclaim the glories of antiquity, but also to grapple with the realities of a world irrevocably altered. Consequently, as the Ottomans entrenched their dominance, their control over Constantinople facilitated unprecedented exchanges of knowledge and culture between East and West. Scholars fleeing the fallen city carried with them a wealth of classical manuscripts lost to the Western world during centuries of turbulence. A letter penned by a Byzantine scholar on the eve of the city's fall lamented the loss of a cultural treasure trove, yet unwittingly set in motion a renaissance of intellectual thought in Italy and beyond. Across Europe, universities began to thrive, fueled by the influx of ideas and texts that had long been dormant, prompting a re-evaluation of humanism, art, and science. Driven by this renewed interest in classical antiquity, artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael drew inspiration from the very texts that had escaped the clutches of the Orthodox Church. It was a paradox that the destruction of a city could lead to such a flourishing of culture elsewhere, underscoring the fragility of history and the complex threads of causality that bind events together. The Ottoman Empire, capitalizing on its victory, embarked upon an ambitious campaign that would see it transform from a regional power into a formidable empire spanning 3 continents. The ascension of Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, was pivotal.
He implemented sweeping reforms that not only stabilized his newly acquired territories, but also integrated diverse populations into a cohesive administrative framework. Inevitably, the vast expanse of the empire became a melting pot of cultures and religions, fostering an environment where artistic expression could flourish. The Topkapi Palace, with its opulent chambers and sprawling gardens, became both a symbol of imperial power and a cultural hub, where Persian poets and Greek artists could converse freely about their crafts, sharing ideas that would transcend their individual heritages. Amidst this rich tapestry, the figure of a nameless calligrapher emerged, his ink-stained fingers deftly weaving Arabic script into breathtaking compositions that would grace the walls of mosques from Istanbul to Cairo, embodying the synthesis of cultures that defined the empire. As the Ottoman influence expanded, the geopolitical landscape of Europe began to shift dramatically. Long-standing alliances were tested, and allegiances forged in the fires of conflict reshaped the continent's balance of power. The fear of Ottoman incursions into Eastern Europe prompted a series of alliances among Catholic states, most notably the formation of the Holy League in 1571. Driven by the desire to reclaim lost territory and counter the encroaching power, European nations found themselves in a precarious position, caught between the threat from the East and their internal rivalries. It was within this context that the Battle of Lepanto unfolded in 1571, a naval confrontation that saw a coalition of Christian states attempt to stem the tide of Ottoman expansion. The victory for the Holy League, although temporary, became emblematic of a collective European response to the Ottoman threat, reinforcing the notion that the empire had become a defining force in the geopolitical arena. Yet the legacy of the fall of Constantinople extends beyond mere territorial disputes and military encounters. It sparked a series of cultural exchanges that would irrevocably alter the landscape of both the East and the West. The fascination with Eastern art, philosophy, and trade flourished in the wake of the Ottoman conquest. As Venetian merchants and diplomats established trade routes to the new imperial capital, they brought with them not just goods, but also a burgeoning curiosity about the East. Driven by this exchange, the West began to incorporate Eastern motifs into art and architecture, as seen in the intricate tilework of Renaissance palazzos that mirrored the opulence of Ottoman design. The interplay of cultures was further enriched by the arrival of spices, textiles, and knowledge, scientific and philosophical, that flowed across borders, revealing the interconnectedness of seemingly disparate worlds. The fragility of history can be underscored by a singular moment. Had the Ottomans been delayed in their siege by even a few days, the political landscape in Europe might have remained unchanged, allowing for a continued flourishing of Byzantine culture that could have altered the trajectory of the Renaissance itself. The echoes of the fall of Constantinople resound in the very fabric of modern geopolitics, reminding us that history is not a linear progression, but rather a complex network of possibilities where decisions made in the crucible of crisis can shape centuries to come. Today, the reverberations of that seismic event are evident in the lingering tensions between East and West, as the legacy of the Ottoman Empire continues to influence contemporary political and cultural dialogues. As we reflect on the legacy of the fall of Constantinople, we recognize a moment in time that served as a catalyst for change, driving the human experience toward new horizons. The intricate tapestry of cultures that emerged in the wake of its fall showcases not just the resilience of civilizations, but also the enduring quest for understanding and connection across divides. The annals of history remind us that while cities may fall, the ideas, art, and connections forged in their shadows can illuminate the paths of those who come after, echoing through time with the weight of consequence and the promise of renewal.